All right. Well, very good. And good evening, everybody. Thanks for having me again. Back a couple of months ago, I gave a talk on using FRS and GMRS radios for public service use. And that was really focused on basically providing some training for CERT teams and other community organized groups where they didn't know much about radio, and you as the ham were kind of the expert. And the whole idea was to get you to train them up so that they could use radio with some decent protocols and understand the limitations and work effectively on their own in their local communities, particularly in their blocks or a particular incident site. But it was really focused mainly on operations and a little bit on the radios. And one of the questions I got near the end of that presentation was, what about MURS? I didn't talk about that. Well, there are a couple of public, personal radio services that I didn't talk about. So I thought I'd supplement what we did and talk a little bit about those services themselves, particularly the regulatory environment around them and some of the advantages and disadvantages, limitations, and what the rules apply to these various services that are licensed by that are provided by the FCC's rules, so that you'd be more familiar with them should you run into them, or maybe even decide to use some of them. Okay, so let's first talk about the regulatory structure. As you know, Code of Federal Regulations 47 CFR has various parts in it, and there are several parts that apply to the FCC regulatory structure. Part 97, of course, we're all familiar with because that contains the rules for amateur radio operation in the US and possessions. Part 90 is for licensed land mobile radios. That would include public safety radios. That would include fire, police, and municipal, and so on. It would include commercial and industrial. So that would be the security folks at a manufacturing company. It could be taxis, hotel operations, or whatever. Construction companies. Lots of uses for the licensed land mobile radio there, and also for some location services. So that leaves Part 95, and Part 95 is titled Personal Radio Services. So let's see what's in there. Well, there's 13 subparts to this thing, and we're going to go through just the ones that I think are relevant here. The first part is general rules. Those rules apply to all these services. Then subpart B is the family radio service, and we've talked about that before, but we'll go over some of the particular features there. Subpart C is for radio control services, and that would be including things like model aircraft and so on. Subpart D, Citizens Band Radio. Some of you may even have come from Citizens Band when you got your ham license. And it's still around. Some of the rules have changed, so we'll talk about that a little bit. Subpart E is General Mobile Radio Service, one of my favorites for non-hams, and we'll discuss that. Then you have parts F, G, H, and I, and these relate to subscriber services, medical, such as body-worn medical telemetry, body-worn and implanted devices, and so on. Subpart J is multi-user radio service, or MURS, and we'll talk about that one. Subpart K is for personal locator beacons, such as you'd use when you're out hiking in the wilderness or skiing or what have you, for getting emergency help. And then subparts L and M cover vehicle data transfer and vehicle radar. And this is up in the 40 to 70 gigahertz range. So this is where your vehicle knows to brake when you forget to do that, and the lane warnings and all that. That's all done with millimeter wave microwave, and that's its own set of services that have their own rules. So let's look at these general rules. These apply again to all these services. First, they can't be used by foreign governments or their representatives. Anybody doing this using any of these services must allow FCC inspection of their station if asked. You cannot use them to create any broad material, content or advertising for to be used on radio or television broadcast. So they can't be used for news gathering or anything like that. You cannot use them for messages for hire or for common carrier services. You can't compete with the phone company by using these radios. And you can't take these messages for pay. Of course, no transmissions related to illegal activities. That should be obvious. No intentional interference with another station. So, the gentleman's rule, is dominant there. No false or deceptive communication. Among other things, that includes no false distress calls. They have a specific prohibition against false distress calls because obviously that ties up, public services that otherwise could be used for real necessary calls. No non-certified or modified equipment. And we'll talk about that again in a second. And then finally, no voice scrambling or encryption. So let's go back to this non-certified or modified equipment. There are some radios out there that you can buy for amateur radio that are opened up. That means they transmit on all sorts of frequencies other than amateur. And, Baofeng is one of the more commonly known ones. But the warning here is that just because the equipment can transmit on these frequencies doesn't mean you're allowed to. We'll talk about what's allowed for these particular services as we go through. So, be aware that you say, oh, I can use MURS because I have my Baofeng and, I have all the ham stuff programmed in, and I also have MURS and I have FRS and GMRS. So I only need one radio for all this stuff. No, that's not right. Yes, it'll work, but it's illegal. So please be sure that you don't want to risk your amateur license by violating the rules related to these other services. So let's look at the frequency ranges for these things. Citizens band, of course, is just below our 10-meter band, and it's in the 26.9 to 27.4 megahertz. So that's in the HF area. Now, obviously, during the lower part of the sunspot cycle, it performs about like 10 meters, and that is you don't really get any distant propagation. But during sunspot peaks, I remember the CB folks bragging about talking to Australia and New Zealand and all over the place because, of course, it propagates pretty much like 10 meters does. And there were times when you could talk all over the world on 10 meters and you could talk all over the world on CB. Right now, and also CB used to be limited to just AM transmissions. Well, they changed that later, and we'll talk about that. So you've got 40 channels there. And then on FRS, of course, you have 22 channels in the UHF range for the up above our 70 centimeter band, 462 to 467. And then in the same range, you have 15 channels for GMRS. It's pretty much the bottom 7 and the top 8 channels of FRS are also GMRS frequencies. The ones in the middle, 8 through 14 on FRS, are handheld only and limited to half a watt. So the GMRS radios can't go there. And we'll talk about power limits too in a minute. And so then both of these are UHF, and of course the propagation is much like you'd have on our 70 centimeter band. And then you have MURS. This is 5 channels, so it's not as many, and it's in the 151 to 154 megahertz, a little ways above our 2-meter band. And you can think of the propagation there as similar to what we'd experience on 2 meters. What's the maximum transmit power? Well, for CB, it's 4 watts on AM or 12 watts on sideband. Now, it used to be you couldn't use sideband, but it became pretty popular. And of course, we know that sideband is a much more efficient mode than AM. because you're not putting most of your power into the carrier. The information is all going into the intelligibility part of the signal. And that means the old AM radios, of course, you would have to have the carrier transmitted with the signal. And sideband, of course, this carrier is suppressed. And instead you have what's called a BFO, or beat frequency oscillator, just like we do in our amateur gear. And that's basically you're providing the carrier and the receiver, which means you have to tune a lot more carefully than you do on AM. Those of you who are HF operators, you know that single sideband requires that you tune pretty carefully in order to get an intelligible signal and to be understood. Whereas on AM, you can be off a couple of kilohertz and you'll still hear it and be heard okay, because the carrier is writing with the transmitted signal. It's not based on where your receiver is tuned. FRS is a limit of 2 watts on most of the channels, except in those middle 8 through 14 that I mentioned, where the limit is ½ a watt and it's handheld only. GMRS depends on which channel you're on. The first 7, which are interstitial with FRS, you can use up to 5 watts, so a little more than the FRS radios. We can't go on channels 8 through 14 that the FRS uses, but then on the top channels, 15 through 22, we can use up to 50 watts. And we talked earlier in the June presentation about the concept of having a GMRS station as kind of your central hub with 50 watts, and then they would use that to talk to the FRS stations on those channels 15 through 22. So it would be easier for everybody would have somebody that they could hear. Now look at MURS. The limit there, this is our VHF service. The limit is 2 watts. Okay, so think of your 2-meter handheld on the mid-range power setting. That's pretty much what you've got with MURS. What about licensing? Well, on Citizens Band, you used to have a license, but they abandoned that a long time ago. So now, unless you have a history of past violations, you may operate without a license. And it is for use by individuals, not by companies and so on. That's for individuals. FRS requires no license. It can be used by individuals and businesses. So you could have somebody using it to talk between the mobile pickup spot for your local Walmart and the supply room inside. It could be used by any number of businesses, but for the most part, it's individuals. These are the ones that people buy in the bubble packs at Costco or at their sporting goods store. GMRS is the only licensed service in this group. The license is good for 10 years, just like the amateur license. It now costs $35 for that 10 years, the same as an amateur license now. And only individuals may be licensed, not companies, not municipalities, and the individuals may also have that license used by everybody in their immediate family, parents, siblings, children, and so on. So one license is good for the whole immediate family. So that comes out to a pretty good deal. It's about 1 penny a day. Now, there are some grandfathered stations. They had to be licensed before, I think it's in the 1980s. I got a call from somebody who asked about using GMRS at their local sheriff's department, not in Los Angeles, it's another county. And they said, yeah, we back a couple of years ago, they got some money and they bought a whole bunch of these GMRS radios for everybody to use when we're on their deployment. Well, the problem is the sheriff's department isn't authorized. They weren't around they weren't using these radios back in 1980, so they're not grandfathered, and they're not individuals. They're a municipality. So I said, their radio officer should have known this because it's in the regulations. You can't use that as it is. What they can do is encourage key people in their support organization to get GMRS licenses. Those people can use those radios under their individual or family licenses, but you can't just hand them out to volunteers and use them on a deployment. So, you know, it pays to know what the rules are. I mean, you as amateurs are used to abiding by rules, and you have to know what those regulations are. So I think it's important that you understand these rules so that you can advise some of these potential client agencies or served agencies properly. They should know, but often they don't, as I've seen. And then MURS does not require a license, and a MURS can be operated by both individuals and businesses, not just grandfathered businesses. So remember, you've got you've got the local auto body repair shop, whatever. They could be using MURS radios. So you have you have a mix of users there. What kind of transmissions can you make? Well, on CB, on Citizens Band service, it's voice only. There's no other service, nothing else you can do besides voice. On FRS, you're allowed voice plus some digital location and location data and queries about digital location. So in other words, some FRS radios have a kind of a, where are you kind of thing, how far are you, whatever. So they have some digital pinging they can do back and forth, but that's the limit of it. Same with GMRS, it's voice only and then just digital location data. But unlike FRS, you can also use repeaters. And these repeaters are operated under the same licenses as their owners. Now, MURS is interesting. You can have voice, you can use data, you can have image and telemetry. So that kind of opens up that service for some interesting applications. Now, the limit, of course, is bandwidth. I think you're limited to 12 kilohertz bandwidth on some of the 3 of the 5 channels and 20 kilohertz on 2 of the 5 channels. So it's not like you can run high-speed data or anything like that. Anything you do is going to have to be pretty low rate, but you can use it. So you think about telemetry, sending temperature or some data like that, wind speed. You could theoretically do that using MURS radios, and there is no repeater operation allowed. So think of, again, if you're handheld on medium power, but you can't use a repeater. So that gives you a pretty good idea of the limitations you're going to have in terms of coverage. What about antennas? Well, on Citizens Band, the limit is either 60 feet above the ground, or if higher, 20 feet above the structure that it's mounted on. So if you're the top of a tall building, you could have it up 20 feet from there. FRS, there are various rules about FRS radios, and among them is the antenna cannot be detachable. You get an FRS radio, you notice you can't unscrew it. There's no SMA connector there. Only the built-in antenna on the hand radio is allowed, nothing external. So that is an intentional limitation because of the number of these things out in the public hands. They really don't want you to get good coverage, because that's just more people you're going to interfere with and more people who are going to interfere with you. I tell people, if you ever want to think about, FRS in a disaster, go take one to Disneyland sometime and hear how many people are on it calling each other. It's a real zoo. GMRS, the only limitations are what you have under the air navigation hazard rules, which is basically the same things that apply to amateur radio. You could have an antenna, if you're not near an airport, theoretically, you could be up, 180, 190 feet. If you are near an airport, the normal federal air regulations, I think it's Part 77, apply in terms of the limitations of, no more than 1 foot vertical for every 200 feet horizontal from the nearest point of a runway 3,000 feet or longer, if I recall correctly. That's the basic provision. But basically, you could, if you have a 90-foot tower, you can put it up on that 90-foot tower. So think about the coverage there. MURS, the limitation is pretty much the same as citizens band, 60 feet above the ground or 20 feet above the structure that the antenna is mounted on, the building that is. All right, permissible equipment. We mentioned earlier in the rules that this stuff must be certificated. The rules actually say certificated for CB and certified and FRS and certified for FRS GMRS. I think they really mean the same thing. But each radio must be specifically and explicitly authorized for use on that particular service. And generally that means it cannot be capable of operating on any other service. That's why I said these opened up radios that do everything, you can't use them except potentially even, I think even in the amateur service now, you get something that can operate all those frequencies. The FCC came down about 5 years ago and started questioning those things. So what kind of equipment can you have? Well, available radios for citizens band, of course, have been around for, since probably the 50s. Midland, Uniden, Cobra, they all make radios. They're still making radios for citizens band. I've seen some YouTube videos where they talk about the death of CB and the fact that hardly anybody's using it anymore. Well, part of that, of course, is from the explosion of mobile phones. But of course, if you're in areas where mobile phones aren't operating, then this is one way to go. Some off-road groups still use citizens band, but to the extent they're sticking pretty close together, there are better options such as FRS and GMRS. But this is HF, so you have a little more distance available, and the radios are still out there. For FRS, of course, we have the Midland, Uniden, Motorola, Kenwood, many other manufacturers. They can come in official looking stuff like this, or the little pink ones with the Power Rangers on them. It almost doesn't matter, except some of the toy ones are a little lower power. But these things are out there. They're pretty rugged. Last June, I went with my brothers and a bunch of their friends up to a remote fishing cabin in Alaska up in the Prince William Sound. And in advance of that, I bought half a dozen FRS radios that are IP65 rated, so that if you dunk them in the water, they won't die. And they're bright color, so we could find them. And I loaded them up with batteries. I tested the internal batteries and found that they didn't last very long, the little rechargeables. So I stuck double A's or triple A's in there and found that they would last pretty much the entire week. And so every time we had 5 boats, so we had somebody on every boat and somebody at the shore with a radio, and we could kind of check in if somebody wanted to let them know, where the fish were biting or when somebody's coming in, what have you. We had that, and it worked pretty well. For GMRS, probably one of the most popular is the Midland MXT 400, and then they have a micro mobile also, and they've got some handhelds that are designed specifically for FRS. But of course, the mobile radios have the advantage of being able to generate that higher power up to 50 watts, which you can't do with any handheld, nor would you want to, just because of the RF exposure. And the MXT 400 is a very popular radio. That's the one we use on the Lake Balboa Sunday morning simplex tests, where we encourage people with these, CERT members and community members with these bubble pack radios to get on. And there we have, maybe a dozen of us around ringing around the San Fernando Valley and beyond, all with MXT 400s and external antennas. And we can hear, one or more of us can usually hear somebody and then relay their information into net control. And, San Fernando Valley, we're talking about, probably 8 by 12 miles. So almost 100 square miles, and most of us can hear one another pretty well. So that's, those radios are very popular for that reason. And then BTEC, which I believe is a branch of Baofeng, has a mobile and a handheld, both of which are certified for use on a GMRS, which means they, or at least I hope, they won't cover anything other than the GMRS frequencies. And then there's a company called Dakota that has various models. I don't have any experience with those. Radios for MURS. On the high end, Motorola and Rytron are the two that are best known. The Motorola had a couple of models out there for a long time, the RDM 2020 and the RDM 2080D. Both of those have been discontinued and replaced with the RMM 2050. Now, these radios are normally on the order of $200, $250 or so per unit. So, that's a bit on the expensive side, certainly when compared with an FRS handheld, which is in the, $20, $30 range or more. And then Rytron has their PT150M. These are kind of commercial grade radios, and that's why they cost a little bit more. BTEC, that branch of Baofeng that I mentioned earlier, does have a MURS certified handheld. It's under $100. And then Dakota, again, also has various models for MURS. So let's talk about the pros and cons. The Citizens Band, no license required anymore. Therefore, there's no ID requirements. And now that they allow single sideband, that's a fairly efficient mode compared to AM. So you can get a little better distance. And but of course, because other than line of sight, the propagation is unpredictable. So the coverage area can be unpredictable. You may find that you're talking hundreds of miles away, or you may find that you can't get out of your own community. There are no repeaters allowed. There are lots and lots of illegal power users. There are people who still brag about the, a 3-pill or a 4-pill amplifier, the pills being like 4CX250s or tubes like that, where they can be putting out multiple kilowatts of power, and your 12 watts is not going to be any match for somebody who's running that illegal power. So that's probably one of the big drawbacks. I don't know how prevalent those users are on the air anymore, because I don't really make a practice of monitoring Citizens Band, but be aware that you're going to be competing with these illegal power users. And by the way, I still see Citizens Band amplifiers, which are clearly illegal, and their advertising and sale is prohibited by the FCC. You'll still see them for sale at truck stops and online and so on. So that's an issue. It's to have an efficient antenna, it has to be a lot larger. Remember, a wavelength is inversely proportional to the frequency. So where a 70 centimeter antenna may be 6 inches long for quarter wavelength, the Citizens Band antenna is going to be 9 feet long. And if you're trying to get something more efficient than that, it's going to become, size is going to become a real issue. I've seen a few people with 3 or 4 element vertically polarized Yagis for Citizens Band. It's allowed, but certainly if you're trying for mobile or anything like that, the antenna is not going to be as efficient for the same size. Remember, any mobile antenna efficiency is going to be based on radiation resistance, and vehicles are generally not very good grounds, if you will, or counterpoises for even a full-size vertical. They're just not that big. There's not that much metal. Often the bonding isn't very good between the antenna and the radio. So you have some of the similar problems that you have with designing a mobile HF installation on amateur bands. But there's a lot of good guidance out there. You can do it, but it's not going to be as efficient. And of course, any handhelds, because a handheld is not going to have a 9-foot whip on it. So those antennas are by definition going to be very inefficient. Just like a rubber ducky on 2 meters is less efficient than a rubber ducky on 70 centimeters because it's got to have more loading in it. Well, on Citizens Band, it's going to be extremely inefficient. So handheld portables, while they may work, for over a very short range, they're not going to be good for any kind of distance at all. And, most of the power is going to go out in heat. All right, pros and cons of FRS. Obviously, again, no license required, so there's no identification. Very low cost, readily available. Quality is generally pretty good if you get the name brands. They're very portable. They're great for short range. As I mentioned, we were getting, around the peninsulas in the Prince William Sound with those things out on boats just fine. And of course, they are interoperable with selected channels in the GMRS service. The cons are that they're very low power, 0.5 watt to 2 watts, depending on the channel. And that, of course, does limit your range. Again, think of your 70 centimeter handheld on low or very low power. There are no repeaters allowed. And because there are so many of these things out in the hands of the public, they can be very, very crowded. Those channels can be crowded, particularly in municipal, dense municipal areas and at large events, whether it's a music festival or a gathering of some sort, or of course, at the big entertainment venues. GMRS, the pros there, you've got the ability to use high power on selected channels. You have, therefore, a considerable amount of range, easy to get 10, 20 miles, something like that, with a decent antenna. You can have very effective antennas. You're not limited by, in fact, typically with the mobiles, the antenna doesn't come in the box. You have to put your own up. I found, by the way, that most amateur antennas, like the dual band or tri-band that I have that covers 70 centimeters, works just fine. 470 isn't that far from 450. And generally speaking, the radio is happy and we talk quite a distance. But if you really want to, you could get a CommScope 4-bay, folded dipole array and have an enormous signal, or you could put up a big Yagi, a quad, any number of things pointed at the desired direction. So you got a hugely efficient antennas that you can use. And of course, you have repeaters available depending on where you are. And that can extend your range even further. And of course, they're interoperable with family radio service on some of those channels. The negatives of the cons, you do need a license, but as I say, 1 cent a day for your entire family, not a big deal. The purchase cost tends to be higher. It's several $100s, like $300 or so for the MXT 400. I haven't checked the price lately, but comparable to a good quality amateur mobile radio. And of course, because it's a licensed service, you do have to identify your transmissions. I think it's a 20-minute interval. I'll have to check on that. And then finally, the pros and cons of multi-user radio service. The pros, again, no license or ID. Because they're operating on VHF, the range may be better than UHF. One of the things that we know is as you go up higher and higher in frequency, dense foliage becomes more and more of an attenuator. On some of the microwave bands, if you're looking into the trees, you can forget it. Absolutely nothing will go through there. As you go down in frequency, you start to get some signals through. But if you're in a densely forested area, hiking out in the woods, the VHF may do a little better for you than the UHF range of FRS. You have voice telemetry and images, which kind of expands the applications that you might use these things for. And of course, because it's not nearly as mass marketed, you have far fewer users, and that translates to reduced interference. On the other hand, you only have 5 channels, and there are potentially some business users on there. Probably not an issue when you're out in the open, but in an urban environment, you may have some competition there. Because the power is only 2 watts, that does limit the range. The equipment tends to be costlier than FRS, even though you're looking at basically the same power levels. So hopefully that will give you some ideas as to the pros and cons of these various services. And that's pretty much the formal presentation. So let's end the screen sharing and see what sorts of questions people may have. Or not.
Okay, Barry, how are we looking in the chat?
No questions in the chat, just some comments.
Okay. I don't see anybody with their hands up yet. You must have had a very good presentation. Nobody's asking questions.
Or they fell asleep.
That could be true too.
Okay, yeah, okay, NA6MB, yeah, 1 cent a day. CBFM, as far as I know, FM is not allowed. It's only AM and single sideband. There may be some radios that are doing it, but I don't think so, because it would not make sense to design and build and market a radio that can't be used legally. Let's see, we do have a question here from Scott in Orange. What are the issues, legal and technical, of using WinLink with GMRS? Well, remember, GMRS is a, the modes there are limited. You can't use data transmissions other than those automated digital location queries and digital location responses. So other digital traffic is not allowed, and since WinLink is a digital service, you can't use it on those services, any of those services. Now you might be able to use it on MURS, but the data rate would have to be very, very low. And I don't know if anybody has tried that, but that's a possible application.
Well, we have a couple of hands up here. Larry, you want to take the floor?
It's blocked.
It's
WinLink does not use those frequencies.
Okay.
Well, I don't know how you'd interface with the radio, because the GMRS radios don't really have a data in and out port, and I guess you could throw in the speaker and microphone connections and kind of wire up your own. And I mean, the program doesn't know what frequency you're on. You would have to tell it you're on VHF or something. So
WinLink knows that it's not in unauthorized, that it's in an unauthorized spectrum.
Oh, okay. I don't know how it knows that, because the radio doesn't tell it what frequency it's on, does it?
No, it's programmed in that way.
Okay.
It's programmed so that, for example, you cannot use your amateur call outside of the ham bands. They won't allow it.
Okay.
Et cetera.
All right. Answers that one. Somebody else had their hand up?
Yeah, I did. I got called on, but no one. Okay, Marty, on this situation here, first of all, NEBS, because you can transmit that. It's not like WinLink, but it's a digital system. But my question remains more is with the municipalities, where they use search and rescue. Up here, they got a lot of guys running with their bow fangs. And you can guess what they're doing. How do you, how can I say, not control, but inform them of their rule breaking?
Well, I mean, we're not the enforcers, but most search and rescue I know are using Part 90 frequencies, which are set aside for that very purpose, life-saving and search and rescue and public safety and so on. So there are channels dedicated for search and rescue applications that are generally UHF, and so and you have often you have power levels that are higher than what you'd have for FRS, for example. Now, whether if they're using Baofangs that are certified for Part 90 service, as opposed to some of the other services we're talking about here, then that would also be legal. I know I'm a member of DCS as well, the LA County Sheriff's Department, and they had a presentation on some of their search and rescue stuff. And they use another, I think it's Wushan, which they said actually makes pretty good radios, more, much higher grade radios. And they said if somebody drops one in the bushes, it's not, $3,000 down the drain, it's a few hundred. And so they were using those for their search and rescue, but those are certificated for Part 90 service. I mean, when you've got, Part 90 available, those are generally, because they're licensed for specific geographic areas. Those of you who ever operated in support of like the Baker to Vegas race or something, where you have all these law enforcement agencies, and they will disqualify a team. This is where it's a 100-mile relay run across the desert. They'll disqualify a team that's using its public service radios, that they have in their police vehicles or whatever, for that race to communicate back and forth, because they're only licensed in their jurisdiction. They can use it in San Diego County or whatever. They can't use it up in the high desert. And they're likely to be interfering with licensed users, whether it's CHP or local sheriffs or police. So those, all those radios come not only with specific frequency requirements, but they also come with geographic limits. We're not used to geographic limits with our amateur licenses. There's no fixed location. We can use our stuff anywhere in the continental US, with a few very limited exceptions when you're running a power on 70 centimeters up near the Canadian border, for example, or down in the Mexican border in a couple of sensitive areas where they have pave laws. But these other services, the Part 90, they do have geographic limitations on them. And one of the, you may remember in the 9/11 Commission report, they talked about the bedlam that occurred in communications when all these responders coming from all over the place were using their Part 90 radios to try and talk to other people, and they were all bumping into one another and basically blanking out the channels because they were licensed on the same frequency for Poughkeepsie and for Buffalo and for Trenton, and you get them all together and they're just going to wipe each other out.
Okay, Timothy, you got your hand up? Go ahead and take it.
Okay, thank you. I'm just taking the Ontario ham course right now, and I'm also doing the American ham course.
Very good.
Because I'm back and forth. Just a comment. It's not why I put my hand up, but I find it's really funny that in Canada you got to be a radio engineer. The way the 100 questions goes, I mean, holy smokes, man! It's engineer intensive. But you go to the US course, it's like, oh wow, real stuff that I can use. But I recently went down to Boston for a conference, and I've got a Ocean GMRS, and I went through a repeater book, and I asked permission of the repeater stations that I was going to follow down through New York from Buffalo for permission to use them, and most all of them came back and said no. We haven't got it set up just yet, or it's not tuned properly, or this or that or whatever. But and I didn't want to just like key up but go kerchunk as I was going, because irritate people, sort of thing. But I've had a CB in my car since I was 18 years of age. I've spent 28 years with police, and as a private investigator, I've been a minister for 20 years. And I'm very involved with fire in the community here now, for the sake of community in trouble. And ham is a big part of them. And I found it really funny that every time we go by our fire station, there's a mobile shack
Mhm.
parked in their parking lot somewhere.
Yeah, ready to be deployed if necessary. Well, places like LA City, our fire department has got, they've got a whole multi-repeater network on 800 megahertz. They've got access to the all the interoperability frequencies for fire departments. They can operate on the Ventura County Fire. So they've got lots and lots of radio resources. But smaller communities, I mean, the same kind of place where you might find a volunteer fire department, they don't have a lot of financial resources or technical resources. And you mentioned the GMRS repeaters not being ready for use. Whether it's GMRS or amateur or anything else, repeaters are, I mean, on paper, they're simple, but there are a lot of issues to work through to make them work properly. I mean, it's like trying to yell and listen at the same time. Okay. And that's what they're doing. And the only difference is they're slightly offset in frequency. And, unless you either have a very, very high receive antenna and a very low transmit antenna, or you've got good cavity duplexers and they're carefully tuned with notch and reject and pass and so on, it's easy for a radio to get overwhelmed. And they also take a lot of maintenance. I can tell you from friends who do the maintenance for some of the major systems out here, and I've done some climbing for antenna work on a number of repeater systems in Southern California. I'm a tower guy as well, and it takes a lot of work, and things go south a lot more than you'd expect. So the fact that most of them maybe we're not ready for prime time is not particularly surprising to me.
Well, it's one of the reasons why I'm sticking with ham, both US and Canada, is because the systems are usually, there's a lot of really knowledgeable people out there who've been doing it for a long time.
Yeah.
Now, I noticed at GMRS, it's not that repeaters are forbidden in Canada legislatively, it's that, here's the phraseology, there's no provision for them in legislation right now. So every once in a while, you'll hear about somebody in some city that's thrown up a repeater system somewhere. But it's hit and miss. So that's why a lot of us, and when I retired, my wife said, I'm going to buy a Jeep to keep you out of the house. So with the Jeep came the radios, along with the radios came Morse code. And along with that came, so I'm on the radio almost all the time. As soon as I hit the car.
And by the way, the guy, one of the guys I know who has a GMRS repeater here in the San Fernando Valley area of Los Angeles, he's using a commercial Motorola gear because, again, the GMRS radios are not made to, bring out the carrier squelch and do this and that. The Motorola stuff, the commercial stuff, and they're also not made to hold key down for long transmissions. Repeaters, they can, when they're busy, they can have a transmit cycle of like 90-95%. And if your radio doesn't have a lot of headroom in terms of dissipating heat and so on, you'll blow them up. I see there's some people who use amateur, gear, and they wire it up so that you have two mobile radios and one's transmit, one's receive. But those things aren't made typically for long, 10, 15 minute, 20 minute, half an hour, almost constant transmitting either, and they'll blow them up. So, the equipment requirements are really almost the same if you're going to have a machine that has any real heavy use to it.
Yeah, I came over to ham because a friend of mine said we were at a Jeep meet one time and his radio was blasting away, and I said, "What is that?" And he said Stony Creek, which is the city which was 30 miles away. I said, "Holy smokes, that's clear." And he says, "Yeah, it's," and he told me about it, and I had a CB, and he said, "You know what? You should really switch over to ham because there's a lot better class of people on ham."
Well, we had a lot of people come into the service when they dropped the Morse code requirement, and there were doom and gloomers that said, "Oh, now it's going to be like CB." But frankly, we got in a lot of folks who were really sharp and really willing to work and provide public service. So that was an unfounded fear as far as I'm concerned. Okay, let's see if we have anything else because it's getting
Yes,
close to wrap up time.
We do have another person. Richard, you got your hand up?
Yes, I do. I just wanted to comment in the chat section, I did list where in the FCC rules that texting is allowed on the GMRS frequencies, and that it's pretty limited though. I know there's been a lot of conversation, with one link, I think you pretty much went past that, but that it's limited to 30 characters, I believe. And to plug Marty, thank you, Marty, great job. And to plug your July 14th presentation about the GMRS, FRS, and emergency communication. When I reviewed that on the YouTube presentation, I made a comment about, I did search and rescue and had to have a GMRS license maybe a couple of years before I got my ham license back in 2014. And this radio is pretty much the gold standard. It's called the Garmin Rhino. You can see why it's called the Rhino. Excellent radio. I detailed some of the features of it. It's expensive, but has GPS, satellite imagery, all these other really important things, especially when you're doing something like search and rescue.
Now, under what service, what part do you know that operates under?
FRS, GMRS.
It is.
And it also, the radio also has the NOAA weather capability. It's just a terrific radio to have. Like
okay,
I said,
so it has receive for the weather channels, and it has it's a FRS capable or GMRS licensed and capable transmitter, and it has GPS. So that's a pretty good combination.
Yeah, and like I said, it does have FRS. It goes through all. Through
well, any radio that at least in the US, if it can operate GMRS, it can't use those middle channels, those 8 through 14, as I understand it.
Yeah.
It's operating on, when you say it is FRS, it should be on the interstitial channels, which would be 1 through 7 and 15 through 22.
Yeah, yes, and it does work through repeaters. It has all of the CTSS and
nice.
However,
Rhino, you say, huh?
Yeah. However, it's any transmission, you can immediately pick up the receiving station's location. You can poll them without any other, but not through repeaters. Important issue.
Right. Well, obviously, you're not. When you're on a repeater, you're not listening to the other. You're not listening directly, so it can't do any of that data transfer, I imagine. But and that we mentioned earlier, pinging of location, sending and receiving digital location information, it's using that feature. And because of the GPS, it knows where it is and knows what to send.
Right. Exactly.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Anybody else?
Barry, what
Question in chat from Rod, K7ZBE. Does repeater include simplex repeaters?
Not that I know of. I mean, there are, I think it's a 5 megahertz offset, much like we have on our 70 centimeter band for repeaters. There may be simplex repeaters, but I haven't heard of any.
I have simplex repeaters are for emergency use. It's basically a single channel. You transmit to the repeater takes your transmission and transmits it out on the same station, but the repeater antenna is up much higher.
So it's a store and forward type thing?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Now somebody obviously would have to set that up and maintain it.
Yes. I mean, there's a couple of MFJ makes them, and there's a couple of other models. They're actually simplex repeaters.
Okay, very good. We learn every time. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you all.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate you all coming. It's been a great, Marty does a great job. I really like when he comes on and does his thing. So people have different talents. This is one of Marty's talents.
Well, I just look things up and try and make sense of them.
Elizabeth wants to know about, are there any hams setting up radio stations in the Amazon to help on GMRS, CB, and drones and stuff to capture poachers?
Okay, I missed part of that. Let me go back to the chat.
It's the very
Amazonian
last-
rainforest. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, first you have to look at what the regulations are in Brazil, because, you know, not everybody has the same set of, I mean, for example, we have the 222 megahertz band here. It's not available almost any other part of the world. Some places FRS, I think our Yasmin Foundation provided some FRS radios for training purposes up to Canada and down to Chile, I believe, and they have the same frequencies and pretty much the same power limits. But frankly, if I were in the rainforest, which is by definition a giant RF absorber, using like 70 centimeter GMRS, you may have some limits on how much coverage you can get in that dense jungle area. But as are hams setting up any stations down there, I wouldn't know. You know, I know that amateurs are amateur radio is used in some other world relief organizations, like you know, medical services when they're going down to remote areas outside the country. And again, with the appropriate licensing, you always have to deal with the appropriate licensing for the amateur side. And I don't know if GMRS is even available in places like Brazil. So you'd have to look at what the rules are there. Amateur radio is allowed. And I believe there are reciprocal operating privileges in Brazil. You can go to the ARRL website and look for international operations and find out what it takes. You know, usually you have to get a local license. I've operated from Brazil many years ago in a contest. We paid to get our own individual license, and then we used the group call sign during the contest itself.
Okay. Does that answer everybody's questions? Anybody else got any new questions?